Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Good morning. Welcome to a short biblical reflection on the reading from the Gospel according to Luke chapter 6, verses 27 up to 38. I entitled it, The Disciples Are Called to Imitate the Father. After the introduction, but I say to you that listen, we can distinguish three parts which are separated by two general statements in verses 31. As you wish people would do to you, do to them likewise. In verse 36, be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. All these parts are built on parallelism because there is a series in each part of a similar statement following the same pattern. For example, in the first part, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. For example, in the second part, firstly, we have series of three statements in the same exactly form. If you love those who love you, what gratefulness is for you, and the consequence, for even sinners love those who love them. And the second statement, if you do good to those who do good to you. And the third statement, if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive. And in the last part also we have similar statement in parallel form. Do not judge, you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. There is so much repetition in our text, therefore I highlighted the same words using the same background color, and I added also some expressions which be considered as synonymous. For example, group represented by the verb to love. In verse 27, love your enemies. Verse 32, if you love those who love you. Verse 35, but love your enemies. And synonymous in verse 37, do not judge, do not condemn, forgive, but in particular the expression in verse 36, be merciful. Second group represented by the verb to do good to those who hate you, similar bless, pray in verse 28, then the verb to do good repeated in verse 33 and verse 35. And the last group represented by the verb to give in verse 30, give to anyone who asks you, and similar synonymous expressions, offer in verse 29, do not withhold, and in verse 30 at the end, do not ask it back. In the second part, synonymous expressions are by the verb to lend. If you lend those from whom you hope to receive, and then later on in imperative and lend. And the verb to give is also found three times in this verse 38. Give, and it will be given to you. And later on, concerning the measure, it is stated, and I translate it here now more literally, because in many translations we can find that it is translated as to put, will be given into your lap. Therefore, I can say that repetition is meaningful also in the sense I would start with this verb to give, which means to go out from oneself, not considering the direction of receiving, but giving out. And now I also would like to stress those two expressions which I mentioned, which separate those three parts. The first one in verse 31 is called commonly as a golden rule, and I translated here it more literally, trying to follow the pattern of the Greek expression. And as you wish people would do to you, do to them likewise. However, I would like now also to point out that in verse 36 we have another statement, and it is not called by any particular term similar to golden rule, because otherwise we would need to call it with something more precious, maybe diamond or something. Be merciful as your Father is merciful. However, instead of calling it as golden rule, the first one, I would say a human rule, because this is the rule which applies among the people. Because if you would like to be treated well by others, you should start treating other people well. And otherwise, if you would treat people badly, as a consequence, people also will treat you badly. So this doesn't require this golden rule to be a Christian. This rule can apply to any human person. However, the second rule, I would call it now divine, because it refers to God the Father who is merciful, and it is now of a higher standard. All these verbs which I mentioned, love, to give, to do good, could be read from purely humanistic point of view, with this expectation to receive in the same measure. And now also we could look at the concluding statement, which I highlighted in the same way as the statement in verse 31, do to them likewise. With the measure you measure, it will be measured to you. Those two statements sound similarly, so they could be also treated in this humanistic way. However, on the other hand, if we considered that there is this passive form, it will be measured to you in singular, because many translations also rendered it differently, they will measure to you in plural in active form, changing completely the meaning. But if we preserve this passive singular third person meaning, as it is called in biblical studies from time to time as divine passive, because as the agent of the passive form could be God himself. So the one in fact who will pay back applying the measure will be God himself. And therefore now this concluding statement would not only connect from humanistic point of view with human rule of treating people expecting to receive from them the same, but now it refers to divine rule, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. And therefore we can also conclude that it will be measured to you in the same way, the forgiveness. We can now connect it to one of the intercessions in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Our forgiveness is conditional. Firstly, we have to forgive to others, then we will receive God's forgiveness. I wish you a nice day, a nice reflection on this reading.